Nigeria's Senate has commenced debate on the general principles of the 2024 Appropriation Bill before the National Assembly and measures expected to be taken to ensure the bill is fully funded. Lawmakers say there is a need to tap into untapped resources and capital investments by government to ensure that the funding of the budget does not suffer a setback. Amadin Uyi reports.
Following the presentation of the 2024 budget before a joint session of Parliament, the time has come to face squarely the reality of how it will be funded. While many agree that the budget has great and lofty ambitions, there are some who believe it will achieve its objectives.
This is a budget of renewed hope, which seeks to achieve job-rich economic growth, macroeconomic stability, a better investment environment, enhancing market development, as well as poverty reduction and greater access to social security.
As lawmakers commence debate on the general principles of the budget, many prefer recommendations expected to help its implementation and raise funds to fund key parts of the budget.
The Bitumen Development Commission will help us to fund the budget accurately, not now, even between now and future. And Ondo State play a very significant milestone in this. So we cannot avoid, Mr. Senate President, not to play 1% of $147 billion markets in the bitumen.
I look forward to interacting with the Honorable Minister of Steel to know how much of this, of the 30% of 27.5 trillion, how much of it he's able to have captured the rehabilitation again of Ajakuta Steel Company and the Niamco iron ore plant, as well as having the solid minerals minister speak about the exploration of other untapped resources for the greater advantage of the people of Kogi Central and Nigeria at large.
My own advice is that we have to, as a matter of urgency, deliberately ensure that our oil production does not decline again. We have duty as members of the Parliament to help the executives to review the PIA, which has become, when we were dancing about the PIA, we thought that after signing of the PIA, Nigerian oil and gas sector will become rosy. But since the implementation of the PIA, bigger problems started. Companies started to leave the country. Even as at today, more international companies are leaving. We have to look at the PIA, especially the fiscal and the regulatory part of it.
With the budget tagged the budget of renewed hope by President Bola Tinubu, citizens will be hoping the budget addresses critical issues affecting the nation. Amadin Uyi, reporting for News Central.
And now to further discuss this, I'm being joined by an economist and senior manager at PwC Nigeria, Abiodun Kayode-Alli. Thank you so much, Mr. Kayode-Alli, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, you listened to the budget presentation. What would you say are the key highlights or significant allocations within the President's proposed 27.5 trillion naira budget for the 2024 fiscal year, especially concerning the sectors like infrastructure, social welfare, and the likes?
Yeah, so the speech actually was a well-prepared speech. I mean, it came out well in terms of what it intends to do with respect to spending as well as with respect to the revenue generation. So I think to start off with, it's important to first of all explain that the budget actually is a tool which the government is going to use to stimulate activities in the economy. So firstly, one thing we must realize is that even though we've seen an increase from 21 trillion to 27 trillion for the year 2024. One important thing we must realize is that given the fact that inflation has been on the rise, and also the fact that in terms of exchange rates, the naira has depreciated, one thing we must understand is that in dollar terms, the budget for 2024 is not as much as it was in 2023 when the exchange rate was lower at 400 naira to the dollar. Right, that's one thing we must understand first of all. Then also, if you consider the budget expenditure per capita, that simply means you try to divide it by the total population, how much is going to be allocated to each individual. So each individual is going to be getting a lower amount in FY24, right, in dollar terms. So that's one thing that we must first of all state. With respect to the sectors that you made reference to, the sectors that the government has actually targeted as priority sectors are still the same sectors that have always been priority sectors, right? That is health, education, infrastructure, right? So and security. So health and education, given the fact that the development of any economy is dependent on the state of its human resources, so it's quite understandable that the government is actually taking cognizance of health and education. It's similar to what has happened in other advanced nations. So those are quite critical sectors that government needs to spend on. I think one key thing is security, which actually has the highest percentage, right? And security is quite key because look at your last report with the respect of bandits actually taking having a field day in the north, right? So it's quite important that government is able to tackle insecurity, because by tackling insecurity, then to be easier for most people to come out and do business. It will be easier for agricultural farmers, for instance, to come out and farm. This would actually deal a big blow to inflation, which has been on the rise, especially food inflation. And it also kind of promotes and attracts investments, right? Foreign capital coming fiscally into the country, promoting FDI. So I think security is quite key. So in a nutshell, I would say the priority sectors that the government is spending on is quite reasonable.
All right, also with the deficit in budget, wouldn't this be a daunting challenge, getting capital investments to fund the budget and run governance in this budget cycle?
Yeah, so the deficit in itself, which is quite key, it's considering the fact that Nigeria has challenges with generating revenue, so that's the reason why you see us running a deficit budget, right? So it's not necessarily going to pose a challenge with respect to attracting capital. Even though it is a factor in attracting capital, I think more critical factors when it comes to attracting capital have to do with government policy. Right, what exactly is government, what are the signals that government is sending with respect to attracting foreign capital? So this has to do more with the MDAs. So if we look outside the executive arm of government, you look at the ministries, the departments, the agencies, the ease of doing business, it's quite key that the MDAs are also in sync with government's intention to attract capital. And that's why we talk a lot about implementation. These are the arms that actually implement government policies. So with respect to the ease of getting a license, for instance, how easy is it to get a license? How easy is it to get a certificate which you need to run your business, right? It's one thing to say that Nigeria is a place that is welcoming foreign investment. It's another thing to actually see it work. And I think that more bodes well to the attitude of government agencies, right? So they all must be in sync with government rhetoric. So I think that is quite key when it comes to capital attraction. Then also with respect to the things we said earlier, such as tackling insecurity in the country, this is really one way to tackle to attract investment. And I think one key thing also has to do with government management of its finances, right? As long as government is borrowing, as long as government is borrowing for infrastructure and it is actually using it for the purpose for which it borrowed these loans, and the foreign investors can see this, especially the bilateral and multilateral institutions, this actually goes a long way in attracting the much needed capital. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the current deficit financing that we are running. I think the most important thing is how we actually utilize it in quality spending as opposed to wasteful spending.
Well, some quarters still believe that this budget cannot be implemented. What are the factors that are responsible for poor budgeting?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So when it comes to budgeting, I think one thing we must say, given our peculiar scenario, right, in Nigeria, has to do with corruption, right? I think that's one thing we need to tackle, because you see, when it comes to projects that are being carried out, you see situations whereby there are lots of kickbacks, right? You have instances where different agencies are trying to get some sorts of favor. So this, in a long way, actually affects budgeting, right? And I think another key thing that needs to be looked into has to do with data, right? So you've seen some of the forecasts and some of the assumptions that have been made, and the question is, how do they reflect reality, right? So inflation is currently at 27%, but the inflation that is being used as one of the assumptions for this budget is 21%. If you even look at FY23, right, the inflation rate that was used back then was like 16%, whereas currently it's 27%. So I think getting our data right is actually quite key. Also, when it comes to population, right, because the budget is about spending for the people, it's about spending on people, making lives better. How many are we? We keep churning out the figure of 200 million, right? The question is that the actual number, right? So getting data is also quite key when it comes to budgeting. And I think one other important thing that we must say is you also want to look at the will of government, right? Politics, right? Government should try as much as it can to avoid mixing politics with actually performing the work, implementing the work. And I think institutions are also quite key. It's important we have strong institutions that can actually monitor and ensure that things are actually being used, resources are actually being channeled into efficient use, right? So I think all these things come together to ensure that budget is actually done well in terms of implementation and results.
All right. Also, it seems to be a tall order to assume that the structural, institutional, productivity issues that have constrained Nigeria's economic growth for nearly a decade will be effectively addressed in a year. What significant changes can be made, regarding infrastructural deficit?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. Although the budget is actually a short term, so you can never solve the current problem that we're in a year, right? So I think these key things that need to be done with respect to addressing some of the challenges we have. I think one key thing has to do with, like I said earlier, one key thing has to do with government's the will, right? The political will to actually implement most of the decisions that it takes, right, in terms of policies. I think one other key thing that the government will need to do is to recognize that it can't actually actualize its plan without the private sector, right? The government can't do it on its own. Government is actually expected to stimulate. It's actually expected to stimulate the private sector, right? So, if you remember the advisory council, the policy advisory council of the current administration, the target was to hit a $1 trillion economy. A $1 trillion economy in 8 years. In order to achieve this, you need the private sector. So I think it's quite key that government, as much as possible, kind of makes critical investment in infrastructure, right? In infrastructure in such a way that it promotes ease of doing business. And I think if critical infrastructures that government needs to invest in would be power, right? Like they say, where power fails, things fall apart, right?
Okay.
You see a situation whereby the private organization are responsible for their own power. So I think as long as government invests in critical infrastructure, this can stimulate the private sector into carrying out its activities, right, and assisting in bridging that deficit.
All right, let's take a look now into what the future seems to be. I mean, the challenges that the Nigerian economy faces are numerous. So with this budget, what hope is there for households and the common man?
Yeah, it's called the budget of renewed hope. I think one key thing would actually be, so part of the budget has to do with social welfare, right? So the key concern, like I said earlier, has to do with data. Even though the government has made a lot of borrowings in order to give out money to the vulnerable, the question is by how much can they get to the vulnerable, and that's where data comes in, right? So for me, I think this budget would, in a long way, help in achieving some of the promises the government has made with respect to easing the suffering of the common man. And I'm going to start off with some of the buses that are expected to be imported, right? Those buses that run on CNG, compressed natural gas. So I think these budgets will, to a large extent, be able to ensure that government is able to dole out some of these palliative, these measures, right? Then also other palliatives that have to do with the removal of VAT on diesel to make things at least affordable and cheaper. Then with respect to the security as well, addressing things like security, which will actually make food cheaper, especially in the food producing region, and also investments in critical infrastructure such as road and transport. I think in terms of infrastructure, transport is one of the things that is hugely considered. So I think with government being able to invest in this area, as well as getting support from the private sector, and I think one good thing that the government has for it is that whenever it issues bonds with respect to investments in transport, you see it being oversubscribed, right? So I think government can go ahead and borrow this, make these borrowings by issuing these bonds, and see how the private sector can actually play a role in supporting with financing. Then I think one key thing that can actually help with respect to raising funds would actually be the sale of assets, right? Most of these assets that are moribund, I think to a large extent, by the time government sells these things, it will be able to support its finances.
Right. Okay, Economist and Senior Manager at PwC, Abiodun Kayode-Alli, thank you so much for joining us and, of course, for that broad perspective on the development. Thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.